U.S. debt crisis. When politics turn debt into a weapon. This is the paradox of modern power. When a government weaponizes its own debt, it isn't aiming at a foreign enemy, but at its own heart. History has always taught us a cold, uncompromising lesson, that empires rarely perish on the battlefield. Instead, they commit suicide with their own currency. In 1917, while the world's attention was locked in the bloody trenches of Europe, Washington was quietly loading the gun. Hidden within a mundane administrative shortcut called the Second Liberty Bond Act, they forged what was sold as a financial shield, but in reality, it was a sword hanging over the taxpayer. This was the exact moment the cage door was unlocked, transforming a simple accounting limit into the ultimate political cudgel, a weaponized glitch that now holds your wealth hostage. The debt is the gunpowder, you are the fuse, and the system isn't failing, it is performing exactly as it was designed. The countdown has already started. To understand how this weapon was forged, we have to travel back to an era of excruciating bureaucracy. Before the year 1917, the United States government operated like a small-town shopkeeper, with a very suspicious landlord. Every single time the Treasury needed to borrow money for a new bridge or a post office, they had to walk into the halls of Congress and ask for permission for that specific bond. Imagine the scene, hundreds of lawmakers debating the interest rate and maturity date of a single loan, while the world was beginning to move at the speed of industrialization. It was a tedious and exhausting process that was only possible when government spending was a rounding error compared to today. But then came the Great War. By 1917, the slow machinery of the 19th century collided with the hyper-expensive reality of global conflict, and the system broke. The government needed money, and they needed it fast. They could not wait for Congress to argue over every individual debt instrument while soldiers were heading for the Atlantic. This gave birth to the Second Liberty Bond Act of 1917. On the surface, it looked like a victory for efficiency. Congress decided to stop micromanaging and instead gave the Treasury a wide lane to drive in by setting a total aggregate limit on debt. The goal was never to restrict spending or to save the taxpayer from future ruin. The goal was flexibility. It was a purely administrative shortcut designed to make the business of war easier to fund. In the eyes of the lawmakers at the time, they weren't creating a fiscal watchdog, they were just cleaning up their own paperwork. They wanted to reduce their own burden so they could focus on the big picture, while the Treasury handled the dirty details of issuing debt. This was the convenience lie. For decades, this limit sat quietly in the background of American law, acting as a simple accounting cap that was routinely adjusted without fanfare. It was eventually codified into the modern system in 1982, but the DNA of the law remained the same. What no one predicted was how this quiet administrative detail would eventually be discovered by political strategists and dragged into the light as a tool for leverage. It began as a way to help the government function, but it set the stage for a future where that same function could be switched off at a moment's notice. The shift was subtle but lethal. An act passed to fund the defense of democracy became the very mechanism used to threaten the stability of that democracy. We transitioned from a system of individual approvals to a system of total limits, and in doing so we created a single point of failure. This 1917 shortcut was the original sin of the American debt system. It was born as a tool of convenience, but it died as a tool of control. And as the decades passed, this dormant administrative bug was about to be weaponized by a new breed of politician who realized that you don't need to win an election to change a country if you can just threaten to unplug its bank account. It was the winter of 1995 and the lights were going out in Washington. Imagine hundreds of thousands of federal employees suddenly told to stay home as national parks locked their gates and passport offices fell silent. This was the first time the world truly saw the administrative shortcut of 1917 transformed into a political hostage situation. Speaker Newt Gingrich and President Bill Clinton were locked in a fiscal staring contest that lasted 28 days across 2 shutdowns. The trigger was a disagreement over budget cuts that led the GOP to threaten the debt ceiling. But the real revelation wasn't the policy, it was the leverage. Politicians realized that by simply doing nothing, they could paralyze the strongest nation on earth. The 1995 crisis ended with a modest agreement, but it left behind a dangerous blueprint for every strategist watching from the sidelines. Fast forward to 2011, and the stakes shifted from political theater to an existential threat. A new faction, the Tea Party, arrived in Congress with a radical promise. No debt ceiling increase without massive unconditional spending cuts. For the first time, the X date, the day the US Treasury officially runs out of cash, became a terrifying household term. The world watched in horror as the deadline approached with no deal in sight. Even though a last-minute compromise was reached, the damage was permanent. Standard & Poor's did the unthinkable and stripped the United States of its perfect AAA credit rating, citing political instability as the primary cause. The cost of this game was a staggering $1.3 billion in increased borrowing costs for the American taxpayer. By 2023, the script had become a predictable, yet increasingly lethal rerun. President Joe Biden and the House Freedom Caucus engaged in the same brinkmanship, pushing the global economy to the very edge of the abyss once again. The result was the Fiscal Responsibility Act, a deal that offered modest spending limits while ignoring the soaring $34 trillion debt mountain. Just like in 2011, Another major agency, Fitch Ratings, downgraded the U.S. credit score, explicitly pointing to the repeated political standoffs as proof of systemic decay. Do you see the pattern? Every few years we are told that a catastrophic default is imminent. We are fed a diet of urgency and fear while lawmakers perform a carefully choreographed dance of near collapse and heroic rescue. Yet when the dust settles, the fundamental fiscal trajectory remains untouched. These are not accidents. They are manufactured crises designed to force through agendas that would fail in any normal legislative environment. Each standoff serves as a pressure cooker, distracting the public with the fear of an immediate crash while the long-term debt trap continues to tighten. The debt ceiling has failed to control spending, failed to reduce debt, and failed to protect the economy. Instead, it has succeeded perfectly as a tool for political theater. The crisis ends, but the debt only grows. By design, imagine a family sitting around a kitchen table, voting enthusiastically to buy a brand new Ferrari on a high-interest credit card. They drive the car home, enjoy the leather seats, and flaunt it to the neighbors. But then 30 days later, they hold a second vote to decide whether or not they should actually pay the bill. If that sounds like a fast track to a psychiatric evaluation, welcome to the official fiscal policy of the United States government. This is the central irony of the debt ceiling. It is marketed to the public as a limit on spending, a bold line in the sand to keep the national checkbook in balance. But in reality, the debt ceiling has absolutely nothing to do with how much money Washington decides to spend. By the time the debt ceiling is reached, the money has already been committed, the contracts have been signed, and the Ferrari is already in the driveway. The vote to raise the limit is not a vote for new spending. It is simply a vote to decide if the United States will honor the debts it has already legally incurred. It is a mechanism that fails at the one job it was supposedly designed to do, enforcing fiscal discipline. Since the 1950s, the debt ceiling has been raised, extended, or revised over 100 times. It has not slowed the growth of the national debt. It has only provided a recurring stage for political theater, where the actors pretend to be shocked by the bills they themselves authorized. The absurdity would be humorous if the consequences weren't so devastating for the average citizen. When politicians play chicken with the X-date, they aren't just risking a government shutdown. They are burning real wealth. During the 2011 standoff, even though a default was avoided, the mere uncertainty caused the stock market to plummet, wiping out an estimated $2.4 trillion in household wealth and retirement savings. Standard & Poor's lowered the nation's credit rating, which immediately forced the government to pay higher interest rates on its debt. A self-inflicted wound that cost taxpayers $1.3 billion in a single year. In 2023, Fitch Ratings followed suit, citing the erosion of governance caused by these repeated pointless theatrics. We are told this system exists to protect us from overspending, yet it consistently results in higher costs, lower credit scores, and the destruction of trillions in private savings. It is a spectacular failure of logic, hidden behind a curtain of patriotic rhetoric. The very mechanism created in 1917 to help the government borrow money more efficiently has morphed into a monster that threatens to make that money worthless. We are trapped in a cycle where the cure is significantly more toxic than the supposed disease. And as the drama repeats, one has to wonder if the chaos itself is the intended product. Because if the debt ceiling doesn't control spending, and only hurts the economy, why do those in power refuse to let it go? Imagine a surgeon who intentionally reopens a wound every few years, not to heal the patient but to ensure they never leave the hospital. This is the disturbing reality of why the debt ceiling persists despite being a proven failure as a fiscal tool. If this mechanism is dangerous for the economy and utterly ineffective at controlling debt, we must ask the ultimate question: why is it still here? The answer lies in the dark utility of a state of exception. In a normal, calm political environment, pushing through radical policy changes or unpopular budget cuts is nearly impossible. But in the heat of a manufactured debt crisis, the rules of engagement change. This high-pressure environment becomes a political cauldron, where complex fiscal issues are forced into a few chaotic weeks, allowing politicians to bypass thoughtful debate and force through concessions that would never survive the light of day. It is a system built on the default doomsday, a terrifying vision of a world where the U.S. Treasury fails. We are told a true default would trigger a sudden deep recession, evaporating $10 trillion in household wealth and wiping out nearly 8 million jobs. This vision of economic apocalypse, where Social Security stops and global markets freeze, is the ultimate leverage. Fear is used to paralyze the public, making them grateful for any rescue deal, no matter how modest or ineffective the actual reforms are. This cycle of brinkmanship has become so normalized that major credit agencies now cite the political standoff itself as a reason to downgrade the nation's rating. The debt ceiling remains because it works perfectly as a tool of coercion, allowing elite factions to hold the entire nation's prosperity hostage for a seat at the bargaining table. It is a weaponized glitch that serves the interests of those who profit from chaos, ensuring that the fix always preserves the underlying power structure. The reality is cold and uncompromising. Some mechanisms do not exist to solve problems. They exist to ensure the problem remains useful to those in power. The debt ceiling is not a guardian of your tax dollars. It is a stage-managed drama where the ending is always written before the curtain rises. You are told to fear the default, but the real danger is the normalization, the fact that your financial stability is now a recurring bargaining chip for the elite. In a system built on debt, The ceiling isn't there to stop the rise. It is there to make sure you are too busy looking up to notice the floor being pulled out from under you. We have watched this theater repeat from 1917 to the present day, and the result is always the same. Your wealth is eroded by uncertainty, while the power structure remains untouched. The patterns of history do not lie. They only repeat for those who refuse to learn them. If you have seen the pattern today, leave a 1 in the comments to let us know you are watching. This is Financial Money History. Subscribe to decode the game before it is played against you once again.